I see it.
Because I'm traveling to one place, and then I'm going from that place to DC,
gotcha.
and then I'm going from DC home.
You'll be able to do it all in one trip?
Yeah, I have to do it all in one trip. So I was planning to give myself a month, and I have family working to help me do that. So I could spend, and I was planning to do this summer. So I can spend at least 1 month, 2 weeks in one place if necessary, and 2 weeks in another place. And I have been to the Library of Congress before, so I'm very familiar with it. For a lot of people, it's overwhelming, but I've been there, so I won't have to deal with a lot of the extra drama of trying to figure out where things are. Schaumburg is smaller, easier to maneuver through. But overall, I believe it'll cost me about $2,000, which it might as well be another zero added to this, because that's how big that is. But for me, this will get done hook or crook. So if I have to drive in my car and sleep in it, that's exactly what I'll do. And this research will get done no matter what.
Don't drive through Baltimore.
Okay. All right, and so lastly, it's my roadmap. And to help understand when I plan to work on this research, and of course, if I get the permission to begin the process here. And so it starts for me with my dissertation proposal defense here, right now today, April 30, 2015. If approved, I'll begin collecting all the texts. I have some of the texts, but I don't have nearly enough. So I'll start that process of collecting the texts, which will include travel as well. And a lot of that process with travel includes copying things, because you cannot take books out of these places.
Your phone.
Yes, we have a scanner at the museum that I hope to be able to just take and sit with and scan pages. So I hope that's how I'll be able to do that. Once I complete that, and I expect to be done with the collection of all these texts by August, the end of August this year, then I'll move on to the analysis of race in North America. And I'm doing them separately and then together. So separately first and then all together. I expect to have the analysis of North America done by the end of July of this year. The analysis of race in Spain completed hopefully by October of this year. The analysis of race in Portugal done by January of next year, and then look at them all together, looking for the patterns, the similarities, comparative analysis will continue. I'll be doing that throughout this process, but I'll continue it for the discussion and conclusion, which I hope to have complete by May of 2016. So that's my tentative schedule, and this is my roadmap of how I expect to get on the process of doing this dissertation, and I plan to go in what someone refers to as beast mode. And so I will be in beast mode right away. Okay? All right, and that is it. So we will open up for questions.
So with your title, looking at the social, legal, and historical construction, obviously studying legal record is plain and simple, but looking at the laws that were in place, historical moments, it's easy. How do you plan to pull out the social part?
That I expect to see in the writings. Like people like Bishop Bartholomew de las Casas, there's a lot of historical texts. In Spain and both Portugal, they had historians. And they had historians that would keep track of things that were happening in time. I think I'll be able to get the social not just from those historical texts, but also from the things that were taking place, the documents that they have of, and it's exceeding how much document they have on the kinds of people that existed in certain societies by cultural group within the societies, even some semblances of classes in certain societies. So that research has, parts of that research has been done differently from an analysis of race, but understanding the societies socially has been done. So I believe I'll be able to pull that from a lot of the historical texts in both Spain and Portugal.
Okay, so this is similar to your question, and I am all for interdisciplinary work, and there's a subset of sociologists who would describe themselves as historical sociologists. But and I mean, but is not the right word here. I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, okay, you're doing a PhD in sociology, but this is just could as easily, if not more easily, be a dissertation in history. So I do appreciate that you're bringing in sociological theories and linking them to this. Not really sure it's a question or a comment. It's more of a, I want to be reassured that this is at the end an end of sociology, sociological examination of this. Because that's sort of what you're, in a way, you're kind of asking that, where's the social, that's what, for me, I'm thinking, where's the sociology rather than history, right? So can you speak to that distinction? I don't really have a question, just throw out that as a topic.
Yeah, I think that where I gravitate to more is how sociology was studied in the past. And so I think I'm one of those sociologists that probably came out of sociology 100 years ago, because that's how I prefer to examine our social world. I think quantitative research is very important, but I think that quantitative alone can't answer the questions in its totality. And doing these historical analysis like Marx and like many of the founders of sociology did in the past, is that's pretty much how they studied societies, how they were able to examine social relationships within societies and come up with theories. That's what I hope to be able to bring back. And there are quite a few scholars in present that are leaning to doing more comparative historical analysis, not to take away from the significance of quantitative research, but just understanding how taking long periods of time, big picture questions, and being able to answer questions about processes over time is something we can't do when we have so many cases. But when we're examining a smaller number of cases, we can get at what's happening in these societies over extended period of time. So I think that what I'm doing is bringing back the type of sociology that was done in the past, this type of sociology that founders of sociology were doing. And I think that's important. I think it is as important as quantitative research, and I hope to make it matter again.
So think of what I'm understanding you as someone like Marx, is really speaking on classism in society and essentially where these hierarchies come from. His attention is placed on capital, right? So here, you're going way back to essentially say, what is this root of racism?
Right.
And with that, Fagin has been saying for a long time, he always goes back to, in claims, 1680, this is when people started to use black and white, and that we have this unique type of racism that we invented in the United States. And you alluded to that centralizing on the British, right? And so what would you say to Fagin with your major questions? You're just combating him and saying you're completely wrong.
Well,
and why is it important to Fagin to know that?
I definitely wouldn't say to Fagin in his face that you are completely wrong. But I think it's a testament to how people study, and people study what other people have done. And if everyone is concluding the same thing and they're using the same sources, then they're going to all talk about the same thing. But sometimes I think that's why interdisciplinary research is important, because we look at different sources. We have a different way of seeing it. And I would say that Fagin is in that group of scholars that looks at race outside of North America as less significant. But then I go back to what Ami and Wynot said, even though they don't study this time period, but they did definitely say that if race exists, it matters. It should not be minimized into something that is insignificant, because if it exists anywhere, it's significant where it exists. And so if I can provide the evidence for Fagin to show that concepts of race, as we look at it today, existed in Spain and Portugal during the 1300s and the 1400s, then hopefully Fagin would recognize that those periods of time and these places are worthy of study, and that however it exists, we need to understand that so we can understand how it affected the creation of race in this society.
You would absolutely agree. So I think you should have a conversation.
Okay.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
Why are you assuming that that race emerged at this conjuncture, at this moment, when the Portuguese and the Spanish encountered Africans?
Actually, no, because the Portuguese and the Spanish were trading with Africans well before the 1300s and the 1400s. And there are scholars that suggest that we can trace race and its racial beginnings to the Middle East around 600 AD. And so I'm doing literally how we do genealogy for people. I'm just starting where I am and choosing the nations, or like I'm choosing the grandparents. You know, I know I'm in America, I know who my mother is, and this is my mother's mother and my mother's father. And so that's like what Spain and Portugal are. So I'm choosing these two places not to say that this is definitely the origin of race, but that it does exist there. And I need to see the ways that it exists there. And I think it's very likely that I'll find out that it did not begin there, you know, which will be the next step for research for me.
Right. I mean, I think it's interesting. There's a sense in the proposal, in the presentation, that by examining by comparing these particular cases in this particular moment, that you will uncover a pattern of racialization that has not yet been chronicled.
Yes.
But there are scholars who have, and you cite them in there, but I can see them in the reading list. Scholars, historians, and others who have examined engagements between Europeans and Africans and other groups, right, that precede this period but that are in this period. So, just at the broadest level, I have specific questions. I'll get to those in a second.
Okay.
Like at the broadest level, I mean, what is unique about this particular moment in these particular nation states, which at that point were fairly new, newly consolidated, right? And their boundaries would shift, and they weren't in any way fixed at that time. But what is unique about that specific moment that is worth focusing on?
For me, these nations, and it connects to the discussion of the slave trade, because Spain and Portugal are integral in the slave trade. These are the two nations that literally had control of the slave trade. The Portuguese gaining control, and these two nations agreeing with each other, that the Portuguese were going to control Africa and everything that would come out of Africa in trade, including the people, and that the Spaniards would control the trade to the Americas. And so these two nations, for me, connect to the discussion of slave trade itself in the origin of race, in the discussion of race. And they're very important because most people, again, leave these nations out. But I think these two nations had a great deal to do with how North Americans would view race, because these two nations literally divided the world amongst themselves. And because of that process, created an essentially raced slave trade, an all African slave trade. And so I think the choice of these two nations is increasingly important because it connects these two nations to the slave trade itself that most scholars will connect to studying race and its origin.
So then, but isn't that one of the concerns you were raising, that there's a certain historical analysis of race that centers on this, not only slavery, but the transatlantic slave trade? So how are you getting outside of that by comparing these two cases and by highlighting their centrality to the racialization of the slave trade, when that's the very thing you think that needs to be moved beyond in the historical analysis of race?
Yes, actually the slave trade is the end of my analysis. So the slave trade will actually have begun at that period where I stopped looking. I'm looking at these two nations and what was happening in these two societies that it would lead to an all-African slave trade. And so the study actually precedes the slave trade itself. And so by default it's included because these are the two nations that spurred that process. But the time period that I'm studying is what was happening within these two societies before these two societies even recognized that the Americas existed.
Right. Okay, so then you, in the method section, you focus on you define three cases that are going to constitute your analysis. There's Spain, Portugal, and North America.
Yes.
Why does North America need to be a case?
Well, because what a lot of people who study race say is that North America is so different. Yeah. North America, the race and racialization that took place in North America is so different from any other place that is unique. And so when I do this process, I want to be able to talk about the process of racialization in North America, because if I see this process in Spain in 1300s and the 1400s, and I see this process in Portugal in the 1300s and the 1400s, then the racialization process that most people think is so very unique in North America is not true, or won't truly be as unique as they think.
Right, but do you have an historical documentation that pertains to that particular period in North America?
Oh.
Right. So if it's 13th and 14th centuries, Portugal and Spain, do you have access to comparable historical evidence in the North American case in 13th and 14th centuries?
No, and I'm not comparing America in the same century. It's like a longitudinal almost study over time, where I'm watching race progress. And I'm going backwards.
For in North America, what time period would you be focusing on?
That would begin in 1500s. And so I'm starting 1500 through present time. And so I'll be pretty much summing up what a lot of people already know, these major points in the processes of race making, and then going backwards to compare.
So I'm just thinking, beyond today, as you're beginning to construct the study and beginning to write, do this archival work and put these chapters together. If you can construct the North American case based upon pre-existing scholarship, the secondary sources, and not need to do primary data collection for that case, because the time period's different, right? You're not comparing, you're comparing apples and apples to oranges, because you're not dealing in the same time period. In fact, there's a linkage between what happens in North American case later and what happened in the Portuguese and Spanish cases earlier. So I guess what I'm asking is, I'm not sure that North America later needs to be compared alongside of and in the same way as the way in which you compare what happened in Spain and Portugal through the primary work, right? If the point is to just simply say, scholars of race who has analyzed North America kind of have missed this other stuff, can't you make that claim, can't you make that argument without doing primary data collection about North America in the 1500s to present?
Yes. Yes, I could. I could make that argument with all secondary data.
It's simply a reference that Spain and Portugal will be seen as how they reflect in comparison to, presumably, if you're going all the way to modern day or in North America. You're saying from the 1500s to the 2000s, that's a pretty big, so basic, my sense is you're saying, what is race like now here? And or our conception of race in the United States over the last 500 years?
No.
But that has changed tremendously.
No, the question is whether or not the social and legal construction of race that took place in Spain and Portugal during the 14th and 15th centuries was different from or similar to the social and legal construction of race in North America during what period?
Yeah, right.
If that period is later, then it seems to me like the two cases that would constitute your analysis would be Spain, 14th, 15th centuries, Portugal, 14th, 15th centuries, and the North American case wouldn't really be a case in the same sense that the other two were, but rather a kind of a contextual, almost like a literature review of how we understand racialization in North America. But you wouldn't go and for example, you wouldn't go to the Library of Congress looking for evidence of kind of racial thinking in North America. It would be Spain and Portugal.
Right. I don't expect to reinvent what other people have done, and so I wouldn't be doing that. And I see North America as a chapter in my dissertation, and I see it as necessary so that people understand the comparisons that I'm making. But it does not have to be a case in and of itself, which limits the work.
What's odd about this is that normally you could have a chapter and there was this historical contextualization. But normally you would be looking back to a time prior than the evidence that you're studying, but it's flipped here,
Right.
where she's looking at evidence that precedes essentially what I conceive of as a reference that makes sense of, this is how we make sense of race here in North America in this time period. And then she's analyzing. So I can see a historical contextualization, I don't know if I'd call it that, but because it implies sort of a prior, but I agree with you that she doesn't you shouldn't be doing analysis of North America. That should be not primary analysis,
Right.
And that wasn't your plan.
No.
Well, it's, again, as written, it seems like, and you define the 3 nation states
Right.
as the cases.
But she had X's in North America. All those were filled already, right?
It's all
The
been done.
blank,
Things known.
Yes.
Yes.
and those X's represent.
Yes,
that-
I'll go back to it.
Okay.
Let me go back. Yeah, so for the methodology, I fill them in, because we already know these things.
So we already know
People have
this.
already answered these questions.
So she's answered the previous.
So it's all in those second and third columns in reference to the first.
Right.
So if these things are known and known by you, why in your plan do you allocate time to researching them?
Right.
If they're right, I mean, just in terms of, again, just thinking about going forward, like if you're allocating time to kind of writing the North American chapter, couldn't that have already been done?
Well.
I mean, I
don't
it's
No
part of the
analysis is necessary for that. It's a literature review.
It's-
If
okay,
she's
it's a literature
comparing,
review.
And if she's critiquing the claims of North America, then she needs to write the chapter to say, these are what scholars claimed about the root. Now I have this evidence that this precedes it, that I see that as a necessary chapter.
Oh, yeah.
I see it as necessary, but I guess I'm wondering about, and this is another question, about kind of the sequencing of the narrative in the actual dissertation. So if the North American chapter comes first, right, so it's North America first,
Right.
and then the Spanish and Portuguese chapters come second, maybe a comparative chapter, right? Maybe, I'm not sure how this actually is a question of how it's going to be structured. The analysis of North America, it's not really analysis, kind of situating race within social structurally,
Right.
I mean, why not would say, within the North American case, I'm not sure how you can compare that case, which deals with a different historical time period, to the cases that would come later, which would be the Spanish and Portuguese cases, which deal with, 2 centuries earlier. And there's a historical linkage between the two. If it were not for the actions of the Spanish and the Portuguese,
Yes.
the North American case wouldn't have unfolded the way that it did.
Yes.
But there are scholars who are arguing that race emerged in North America in a qualitatively different way, and she's looking at Spain and Portugal and saying, wait a second, listen, there's evidence here that race already existed, and how is it different, right? I mean, that's
Right.
essentially what how is this conception of race different than in those 2 places than it is in North America post 1500, right?
I'm not sure I
So
understood.
I think on the roadmap, literally the road you have here, you have time set aside for going,
Oh, Lord.